Hey guys, my name is VaulSC. Today we're going to be talking about Conquest. It is the tabletop wargame made by Parabellum, the fantasy rank and file tabletop wargame that I've been getting into, and specifically I'm going to be running you guys through the various factions that are playable for the game at the moment. I'm recording this on the 22nd of July 2023, so by the time you watch this video later on, there are going to be more factions and more updates eventually down the track. But for now, let's just have a look at a snapshot of the playable factions that you can actually have in this game, and we'll go through them each one by one. You know, when somebody's new to the game and they walk into the room and they say, hey look, you know, I like to look at some of the factions but not too sure which one to pick, what we tend to do is that all of us seem to say to this person, hey, just play the miniatures that you think look cool. You know, buy the miniatures that are going to inspire you to build them and paint them and play them, and just go with the visuals first because they're all kind of viable. And that advice is good advice. It's true. People really should do that. But when you are that person, like when you first come into a tabletop wargame for the first time and other people are telling you that, you know, it's good encouragement to have, but I think that in that particular situation, people tend to feel like they want something a little bit more, because you already have the ability to look at the website and the catalog and sort of just have a look at the images of the miniatures for yourself. What people kind of want to know is a little bit more about the play style of each faction, maybe a little bit about the lore and the background and the style, and what strengths and weaknesses they may have overall, to get a bit of a preview of what kind of experience they'll have in the long run. Because you might like faction A and you think the miniatures like are wonderful for faction A, but you also like faction B and you know that you have a good time painting those, but you're not too sure whether, you know, one of them would be much more suitable for your style in terms of like actually playing them. So for example, let's say you really want to play a faction that's more into the control game, that starts out a little bit weaker but really just fends off the attacks that the enemy makes, and you're building up and you're controlling the game and you're just crushing them later in the game. But then you buy the miniatures and you realize that they're an absolute glass cannon faction that just must, you know, do as much damage as possible before you get counterattacked, and you end up with the wrong experience. So yeah, I just want to take the time to sort of run through all of the factions at the moment. There are 7 of them available. There are going to be more in future, and just give a breakdown of what they are all about and what they are like. Cool? So without further ado, let's jump into it. We're going to start with the top of the list here, which is the 100 Kingdoms. This is the faction that I have chosen myself. These are the guys that I'm playing. I'm collecting them and painting, and in a moment I'll tell you a bit about why I made that choice for myself. But let's just talk about who they are and what characterizes them. This is the generic humans faction, and don't get me wrong, although there are other, you know, mythical creatures and various different races and beasts in this game, and you can play the other ones, the 100 Kingdoms are not the only human faction. You've also got the Spires, which, sorry, not the Spies, the Nords, excuse me. We'll come to the Spies next, but the Nords are sort of like the Vikings faction. A lot of these fantasy franchises, you know, you've got the Skellige from Witcher, and you've got the Nords from Skyrim, and you also have the Nords in Conquest, and that's like the Viking version of the humans. That's that kind of archetype. And then you've got the city-states, which is more like, you know, for fans of the movie 300 and Troy, it's sort of like the Greeks and the Spartans and that kind of archetype and that kind of inspiration. But let's start talking about the 100 Kingdoms. And I want to tell you that this game overall, Conquest, is a little bit inspired and a bit of a throwback to the old Warhammer game of fantasy battles throughout the 90s and early 2000s and all of that, which was my favorite wargame of all time. And back then, one of the factions I played was the Empire. So the 100 Kingdoms has some similarities with the Empire, but also the Bretonnians. It's almost like you've got the medieval fantasy archetype of the French and the British and the Germans sort of rolled into one. It's heavily inspired by, I think, the Holy Roman Empire, which is, you know, a playable faction in a computer game called Age of Empires. And that's what you get with them. This is like a heavily traditional sort of rank and file and cavalry army. This is a faction that actually does not allow you to play the monstrous creatures like the big giants and dinosaurs, and you can't have the big ogre brute type units either. It's purely cavalry and infantry, and that is the focus of this faction. One experience that I had way back in the day when I was a Warhammer Fantasy player and I played Empire Empire is at the time, the generic humans then felt a little bit underpowered, and to win, competitive tournaments, you kind of had to crutch a little bit on things like the Empire's steam tank, which was a fantasy kind of construct. You also had the Priest of Sigmar, the war wagon altar type thing, and those didn't really feel very medieval fantasy. They felt a little bit more steampunk and a little bit more out there. And also you had to use like war machines, like cannons and things like that. The 100 Kingdoms from Conquest doesn't have any of that stuff. You're purely talking about rank and file, swords and shields, and knights and lances and that kind of thing. You have some spells and stuff in there as well. But despite all of that, in the context of Conquest, you don't really feel like you're just way outclassed by all of the mythical creatures out there. Actually, you can hold your own, and this is not like an underpowered faction in any way. Because the support abilities that you get for your knights and for your infantry are so good. When your friends are showing up with these dinosaurs and undead creatures and giants ripping tree trunks out of the ground and threatening to bash you with them, you have such strong supporting abilities for your stuff that you can take them. You can hold your own. Like it's actually a very viable and powerful faction when you play your cards right, which I'm just so excited about. Having to rely on just hitting them with a cannon or going out with your steam tank. It just doesn't work like that. So that's a faction that's got me really excited. The reason why I picked them instead of the other thing I was looking at, which is the Old Dominion. You guys might remember back in my Warhammer days, if you've been a fan of my YouTube channel for a really long time, I started out with the Tomb Kings, and a lot of people loved watching my bat reps of the Tomb Kings, which, in this game are the closest in style to the Old Dominion, which was the other faction I was looking at playing. We all remember the old Casket of Souls. Which, they kind of have an equivalent unit to that. There's actually this big, sepulture type thing which, zaps people, and it looked appealing. And I may get to that eventually, but the reason why I went with the 100 Kingdoms is that I love to paint my miniatures in really bright, ostentatious colors. I'm painting my army with bright blues and reds and purples. And although you can do that with undead, like there's no reason why you couldn't paint your Old Dominion army that way, I felt it was a bit more appropriate for the faction that had all the flags and the banners and the blazons and the emblems and the shields and all that sort of stuff. So that's sort of what I'm currently doing, and I'm really, really enjoying it. 100 Kingdoms also seems like a faction that is quite mobile. They've got a lot of cavalry, so they're very fast, and I love the idea of outmaneuvering somebody in a tabletop war game rather than just waiting for them to move in and you use your special ability and it's not very interactive. So the thought of getting a bit of movement in there appealed to me. This is a faction where you can play all cavalry if you want to, and that actually is viable. A bunch of people do that. I've built some lists that look like that. The only thing I'm a little bit skeptical about that is that they've brought in a rule recently called pike formation, which means that the effect of impact attacks where you're just charging somebody with your cavalry is not great. If your opponent has a couple of units with those big, pike formation kind of abilities, you might sort of be a bit frustrated there. But it's still, you look at what you can achieve with just cavalry in this game, and it does strike me as very, very viable. The other thing that's quite flexible about this faction is that you can play with just infantry if you want to. They have a character, a leader called the Imperial Officer, who's got a very powerful supremacy ability, which is like a faction-wide ability if you choose him as your leader, which gives every infantry unit a free move when they first come onto the table, because this is a game where you're not deploying everything in a line at the start. Your units come on one by one throughout the first few turns of the game, and this way of playing 100 Kingdoms is, I think some people are calling it goblin mode. It's sort of like we have a lot of infantry blocks, they're swarming across the table very quickly, surrounding the enemy, and sort of just getting an advantage that way, which I think is quite appealing. But overall, what most people will be doing with this faction is having, the best of both worlds and having some infantry and some cavalry, and that is certainly how I'm going to be playing them to begin with, which is something I'm really looking forward to. You've got plenty of spells in terms of the sorceress and the priests. They're a faction that can, tool up their characters to fight well in close combat. The miniatures are just really beautiful. Although some of the miniatures are a little bit older now, and the older sculpts are starting to get a bit old, the newer stuff that's coming out is just amazing. And of all of the factions, these are the guys that have the most, plastic boxes of units released. So you are less likely to be running into like a unit that you want to play where the models haven't been released yet. With the newer stuff, like the old Dominion city-states, they're still catching up. But with the 100 Kingdoms, well over half of the possible units you can run have, wonderful miniatures associated with them that are already ready to be purchased and played. So that is my thoughts about the 100 Kingdoms. I can't wait to play, more games with them and show you guys bat reps and breakdowns. And I'm going to be doing, what I did with, my Infinity content on this channel, where I sort of deep dive into the factions and give you very detailed about, okay, there's this magic item and this magic item and this unit and this ability, and here's why this is good or not good, and the context of it. So I'm really looking forward to do that. But for now, that is my brief overview of the 100 Kingdoms. Just in terms of the lore, I haven't really dived very hard into the lore, but essentially they're called the 100 Kingdoms because they are a big sort of civilization that's broken down into a lot of smaller states, and there aren't exactly 100 of the kingdoms. It just sort of feels that way because the exact number of kingdoms is increasing and decreasing, and they are sort of like the middle ground in terms of the civilization. They are not the oldest, they're not the youngest. They are just there, and they kind of provide a useful context for everybody else, is one way of looking at it. Okay, let's move on to the next faction in our little list here, which is the Spires. This is by far the most unique faction for this game. All of the other factions that we're talking about here have some sort of parallel, some sort of DNA history to other franchises and other war games. The 100 Kingdoms obviously comparable to the Empire and Bretonnians from old Warhammer Fantasy. They're the Holy Roman Empire, but the Spires are a bit more innovative. They're a bit more unique and new and fresh. And the idea of the Spires, they're actually an alien race that, originated from like a different planet that, we're currently on the world of Ea, or however you pronounce that. And all of these factions are, fighting against each other on this one globe. The Spires were previously off-world. They were an extremely powerful civilization, and what ended up happening is that they some of them traveled to the planet that this game is set on, and there was a big, catastrophic fall kind of event with, their main civilization elsewhere. And, the Spires that are moving to this planet are essentially the refugees. A few of them have broken off and they've come here and they've tried to make their own way. And, they are a race that has been laid low, but they still have these pockets of, really arcane, mystical kind of technology. But it's more about, the biotechnology and everything. This is sort of like the body horror faction where they are able to grow their own units. They are able to, essentially have like different tiers and castes in their situation. The Spires refer to obviously the buildings that they live in, and if I've read the lore correctly or remember correctly, they've actually created some of the other factions in this game. I think the Wadroon were the. I'm sure you guys, the lore nerds, can correct me in the comments if I got that wrong, but I remember reading somewhere that one of the factions were actually directly created by the Spires. There was a computer game that came out recently called Scorn, which I thought was a really beautiful looking game. I love the soundtrack, and that sort of gives you an idea of the sort of the H.R. Geiger type thing, the Aliens franchise, where you're in these rooms where even on the walls seem like they are the innards of a human being or some sort of creature. But in terms of the game, the Spires are really interesting in terms of mechanics as well, and interesting in terms of miniatures. They have some troops which are really like low-level drone basic that don't really have much going for them, that are just sort of meat, their cannon fodder, which this alien race sort of puts onto the battlefield to fight for them. And the idea behind those is that they can use their like horrifying abilities to make even those low-level units dangerous. So this game has an ability called Lethal Demise, where if you kill an enemy trooper, it blows up and causes damage to you. So they can have a lot of these weak troopers with Lethal Demise. There's also regeneration in this game, where when you start out with a unit, when it's your turn to move that unit, it regrows some troops. So Spires have the ability to do that. The idea being that their troops are like a bit cheap. They're kind of expendable in the same in a different way than, for example, like the Hundred Kingdoms and the Nords might not think of their soldiers, quite in that sort of expendable kind of way compared to the Spires. The Spires also have some larger, more monstrous creatures, which are just these horrible abominations, which show up on the field, but they're kind of like beautiful and mystic and graceful in some ways as well, like these killing machines. They're kind of flexible in terms of their abilities as well. You have some creatures and characters which have access to like a large pool of upgrades, so there's quite a lot that you can do with them. So I found that kind of cool. In terms of characterizing them, I don't really have a lot of experience with them, but I'm going to have a crack at it. I don't think Spires are the kind of faction that are the most resilient in the game. They don't want to just be taking hit after hit after hit, whereas when we get to talking about the Undead and the Dwegom, they are much more capable of doing that and much more willing to counter-strike you when you do that. But the thing is, the Spires have a few different gameplay styles, so you can play a very regenerate-heavy version of the Spires, where you have a lot of guys who are able to come back as they get attacked, and they kind of play the attrition game, but I don't really think of them as the massively attrition game kind of faction. Nor do I see them as the absolute glass cannon, total all-out aggression type style as the Nords. We'll get to talking about the Nords later, but I feel like they're the most aggressive, just hard out, just wailing on you kind of faction. The Spires, I feel like they kind of want to control the game in certain ways. They want to take the fight to you and sort of overpower you with their abilities without taking too much damage. But they also seem kind of flexible. Maybe not to the extent that the Hundred Kingdoms are flexible in terms of they have so many different sort of ways to sort of build their list. But they're definitely more of a middle ground faction than some of the more extreme ones. I feel like the Old Dominion is a very defensive faction, and the Nords are a very aggressive faction, and the Spires are probably somewhere in between. So I'm sorry I couldn't really characterize them much more than that, but I feel like if you like painting like flesh and so forth, like if you've come from Warhammer and you've painted a lot of Tyranids, and you love painting that kind of like the creatures and the chitinous kind of armor, I think you really love the Spires. Let's move on to Dwegom, which are, essentially the dwarves. Tolkien kind of made the dwarves really interesting as a separate race from the humans, and then Games Workshop came along and had the dwarves as a faction in Warhammer for many, many, many years, and of course they're a faction that you see appearing in a lot of different books and movies and fantasy kind of franchises. The interesting thing about what Parabellum have done with the Dwegom is that they are similar to the classic Warhammer Fantasy dwarves, but back in Warhammer Fantasy you had the dwarves living in the mountains, which were generally the good guys. They were pretty clean. They liked building like guns and axes and stone carvings and stuff. Drinking beer, that kind of thing. But then there was the Chaos Dwarves, and the story of the Chaos Dwarves was that there was a group of dwarves that sort of got caught in the Chaos Waste, and they got cut off, and they kind of had to resort to some pretty savage and barbaric sort of things to survive, and ended up being tainted by chaos. And when you play Chaos Dwarves in Warhammer, you are suddenly able to use magic, which was not really a dwarf kind of thing to do traditionally in that game, and they had access to some mythical creatures and so forth. And I feel like with Conquest, they've rolled both races back together. So this is like a dwarf faction that uses fire spells and has these mythical creatures, with guns on their backs and crazy stuff like that. But at the same time, they are your rank and file axe and shield kind of guys that are like tough and stunty and slow. So this is a faction that is characterized by not being like really fast. They don't race across the table to surround you and just get the quick hit on you before you can attack back. This is a faction that loves to get into the scrum and just really sort of takes the hit and just whacks back at you, and you're losing your troops faster than they are. The guns are devastating at short range, but they're not sort of these massive longbow, long range kind of things which the Hundred Kingdoms and the Spires can do. In terms of the meta, I feel like the Dwegom have actually been the most powerful faction in competitive play recently. They did get nerfed not long ago, which has sort of brought them back down to a reasonable level. I would probably guess that they are still the most powerful faction right now, but the really encouraging thing is that Parabellum has slowly been making them just fairer and just more level, which is something which is so encouraging to me, which is the main reason why I'm playing this game and getting into this game as opposed to staying with another game like Infinity or some other type of game. So Dwegom, they have a like a sorcerer at the moment, which is probably one of the top, if not the top things in the game at the moment. They pump out a lot of fire damage, and one of the mechanics that they have is that every time they cast a spell, you get like a token, and you save up these tokens, and then you can suddenly spend those tokens to automatically pass a hit roll or pass a defense roll. So when you're rolling 6-sided dice in this game, if somebody just rolls into a really valuable unit and does 10 hits, you can suddenly pick up 5 of these tokens and just ignore 5 of those hits, which can be really like a make or break situation and a very powerful mechanic. I also note that this is a game played in a 6x4 table with very minimal terrain, but the units themselves are so much bigger in size relative to the table, just in terms of miniature scale, that, it often comes down to these little combats and scrums where, combat is inevitable. You can't really avoid your opponent's units. You can't really dance around them very much. And Dwegom seem to really like that. They have a lot of stuff that cuts through armor. They have a lot of stuff that, defends them very well. They have some units which are just really, really, really tough. So they just seem like a really strong faction. I was looking at them as my first faction. I was thinking, well, do I want to play this game and give myself the best chance of winning the most games right now, or do I just want to pick the faction that like appeals to me the most and seems the best? And of course, I chose the latter. But I would encourage anybody who likes the feel of them and the look at them to dive straight in. They're a strong faction. They are likely to become more and more balanced over time as Parabellum continues to support the game. They have sculpts coming out which are just getting better and better and better, and they do still feel a bit like playing dwarves or chaos dwarves, in the old fantasy archetype back in the day, and they are very much unique and differentiated from the other factions, and the mechanics are different from the way other factions work. They're well characterized. They don't have access really to cavalry at all. Each faction seems to have something that they don't really have that's missing that helps them, be identified and characterized. So I think that's good. Yeah, I might even play them as my second faction after I'm done with 100 Kingdoms, which is a long way away, but look, they actually appeal to me quite a bit. I will just add one last point, though, that Dwegom only have 4 character options at the moment, whereas, some factions have 6, 7 character options, so it'd be nice to see that fleshed out a little bit more. It's also the case that I think you, at the moment, with army list building, you're kind of, wanting to take that sorcerer more often than not. It would strike me as weird if you're just really trying to build a lot of lists without using the sorcerer at all. So I hope that that's something that they sort out. I'd love to see them bring in, 1 or 2 more character options and just tone down the spellcasting a little bit. Alright, moving on, we have the Nords. This is the other human faction, and I see the name is just the same as Skyrim Nords. This is your Viking faction, and, what you'd expect to encounter in this faction is pretty much what you get. When you think of the Vikings, you think of sort of like the berserkers. They run screaming at you with swords and axe, and they're wailing and they're chopping your face, and they're just not letting up, and they're just hacking, they're slashing, and the blood's going everywhere, and they just keep on going. If any faction here could be described as a glass cannon, all-out aggression faction, it would be the Nords. But don't get me wrong, I think that the faction still has some things in it that are resilient. You still can build your army in a safer way. You can sort of have counterattacking built into your strategy. They're not like purely one-dimensional, charging across and hacking you. This is a faction that does have access to shooting. It does have access to some spells. It's not just completely just down one lane. All right? Overall, though, like the idea being is that, they've got a faction-wide ability where as your regiments lose troopers and you take casualties, they just start gaining buffs. So, they want to get stuck in early and they want to overwhelm you with a lot of attacks and a lot of damage. This is also a faction that has access to a lot of giants, like these big monsters, and they've got a variety of them. And the giants themselves are different in flavor. You've got some that can sort of shoot at you and like breathe on you with ice, or whatever's going on with the ice or the sea, Jotnar. But for the most part, the Nords don't really want to just get charged and hacked and sort of wait until it's their turn to attack. The Old Dominion and Dwegom are the kinds of factions that typically want to do that. So yeah, if you like playing a glass cannon faction that just really wants to just charge in with a lot of buffs, a lot of really strong sort of stats that are for attacking, like the number of attacks you have, the amount of armor piercing and cleave and all of that you have. The characters themselves can be built in a way that makes them very good for dueling. Like you can really tool them up quite well for being killy and choppy and fighty. So they're a lot of fun. They are a little bit diverse as well. Like I love that you can have like the Valkyrie priest type leader kind of character, and the girls are in there with their swords and stuff, and they are a little bit different from some of the way that the other regiments work. They don't have cavalry, but there are these sort of fen beast type units which are very fast, so it's great to be able to include them alongside your blocks of infantry and your large giants, so you're not just sort of stuck to one type of unit, which I really, really appreciate. So yeah, that's all I really have to say about the Nords at the moment. I've studied them a little bit, but there's probably a lot more to discover about them than I've really sort of covered off here. Next up, we have the Wadroon. I'm not really sure how to pronounce them. These are the orcs. There's, that's the initial way of putting it. The orcs are an archetype, a race that, Tolkien really kind of invented and really popularized, and they've never gotten old. They've never gotten boring. People haven't really got tired of them. Blizzard Entertainment did a lot with the whole idea of the orcs in their Warcraft games. Warcraft 1 and 2, they were really the bad guys, but one thing that happened that was very interesting is that when Warcraft 3 came out and World of Warcraft, is that the orcs, because they were a playable faction, they wanted to make them a bit more of like a nobility kind of race that had some really, really savage guys in them, but some of them were real protagonists, and that's really sort of taken things quite a long way. And a lot of other books and shows and movies and computer games and tabletop war games have evolved that kind of treatment. I mean, I think with Games Workshop, they took orcs in a little bit of a different direction where they're kind of sillier and a bit goofier, and they just love battle, and they have the Wah, which is... Games Workshop were originally a British company. Well, they still are, but I mean, the British men who created, Warhammer and adapted a lot of Tolkien's stuff. They would see like British football culture down the road, where all of the kids were just sort of like, here we go, kind of thing, like going to football matches, and that was their inspiration for the orcs, and that's what made them into this sort of tabletop wargaming faction where you have this big sort of build up to this one charge where they all come rushing across. And Conquest has adapted that a little bit. I mean, Games Workshop had, the stratification of a few different types of orcs. Like you've got the black orcs over here and whatnot, but it was the savage orcs, I think, from the old classic Warhammer, which have been adapted the most for the Wadroon, because these are sort of like the very tribal style orcs, which don't wear a lot of clothes. They have a lot of spears. They've got a lot of headgear. And they still have that kind of mechanic where they build up to one or more turns where they get to make a burst, like a push at you, which is inspired by that Games Workshop style of mechanic. So that's sort of what you're getting here. But the other side to it and the development here is that they are sort of merging this and synergizing this with the other fantasy archetype of the dinosaurs. And after we had movies like Jurassic Park, where people could really sort of imagine dinosaurs being a lot more interesting and sort of powerful and aggressive, but also the nobility again of books like Dinotopia and those sorts of series where you've got humanoid sort of civilized kind of living with the dinosaurs along there as well. You're getting that a bit of that as well. And this is a faction where you can have guys riding on these sort of Velociraptor-style creatures. You've got the Tontor, which is like the big Brontosaurus, which you can play as well. The T-Rex, which again can be ridden on. And they're going to be bringing out some flying dinosaurs, I think. And you can have the very tiny ones rushing around as well. So this faction really is the orcs and the dinosaurs. It's very lovable, very appealing to a lot of people. They seem like amazing units to paint. I really find them appealing for that reason alone. On the tabletop, despite what you might think about orcs from Tolkien and Games Workshop being like a swarm, they're actually a bit more of an elite kind of faction. Like a lot of their troops and their abilities are reasonably expensive, so that's why it's not surprising to see a Wardrun player with slightly fewer regiments than some of their opponents in some cases. It doesn't mean you can't build a very large army with just lots of small regiments. It's still possible. But this is also a faction that allows you to play like this elite, small, tightly formed, well-formed kind of army list. The big dinosaurs certainly, you have to pay quite a few points for them as well. And if you have your character like riding on top of, a T-Rex or like an apex predator as it's called, or a Tauntaur, that's a huge wad of points. In terms of stuff that's missing, the Wardrun don't have a lot of, magic missiles. They're not blasting you with like massive spells like the Dwegom are, and that the 100 Kingdoms are able to do sometimes with their sorcerers and their priests. So the Wardrun don't really do much of that. They have some ranged units like the Slingers, which got nerfed recently, that are sort of pelting you, but it's more the short range stuff. They don't have like the massively long ranged stuff. What Wardrun do particularly well is that if you time it right, they have got this sort of chant mechanic system where their units are sort of chanting this battle cry, which develops and reaches a crescendo and builds up into a mechanical thing where you can actually apply very powerful abilities to your units. So they can be very fast and very aggressive if timed well. So you might have one turn where your really powerful unit gets to move a lot further and just has a much greater threat range, which is scary. Like that's a very powerful mechanic in tabletop wargaming terms. Other than that, though, I don't look at them as being as aggressive as the Nords. They're not as tough as the Old Dominion. They don't pump out the spells like Dwegom do. They're not as shooty, as Dwegom or the 100 Kingdoms. They are not, able to pull the tricks that the spies are able to do. It really more is about the chant mechanic and the system of, timing it right and building up those abilities to really make a play that is, great in terms of tempo, which makes them interesting. I think that's a really good feature, and it keeps them distinct from the other factions, not just in terms of the fact they have dinosaurs, but in terms of the actual gameplay, which I think is really cool. All right, moving over to the Old Dominion. Again, like this is such a cool faction. I was almost going to play these guys. I may still collect some Old Dominion later on. But they are the undead. But, they're not just any old undead. They have a lot of flavor. If you think about like the old Roman Empire, the legionnaires and that sort of thing, it's almost like they're the undead Romans. And I think that's really, really cool. It gives some wonderful flavor. Games Workshop did the Tomb Kings, which are like the undead Egyptians, but they also did the vampire counts, which are a bit more classical undead, where you've got vampires controlling hordes of skeleton warriors and, undead bats and things like that. The Old Dominion aren't vampiric. They are not Egyptian. They have the Roman kind of style, where you're sort of building up your phalanx and your spears and whatnot. And they have that going for them. The thing that makes them really interesting mechanically is that all of their units, not all of their units, I should point out that they have mostly undead units, but they can take a few regiments that are not actually undead, that they're actually human cultists and whatnot. But most of their units, most of the regiments have this thing called animated vessel where, they are undead, they don't run away, so that makes them really resilient. It also makes them expensive points-wise. So where other factions have to take what are called resolve checks, where like you rush into an enemy unit, you kill 10 guys, you've got to make the enemy has to make 10 dice rolls, and like that might cause 5 more people to run away, so you've actually caused 15 casualties. Whereas the Old Dominion, if you take 10 wounds and 10 of you guys drop, that's it. You don't take any further damage, which makes them extremely resilient. But they really pay a points cost for that, so you might find yourself a bit outnumbered, a bit outclassed. In the early game, that is, because they have another mechanic where as their troops are taking casualties, you're putting these tokens aside and just building up this resource pool, which levels up your army slowly, and you start getting buffs as the game progresses. So when you get into the late game, and you're playing a 10-round game, which can go for an hour or two, once you get past the midway of the game, your army has started to really power up, and if you still have some of your more valuable regiments intact, they can just reach real heights of power, and every regiment does that in a different way. For example, you might have a unit that just does more damage on the charge or cuts through more armor as you go up those tiers, which is kind of fascinating, and I think it's really beautiful in the way it keeps the faction distinct and a bit more diverse and just different from the other factions, so you feel like, you know, they have a very particular style. The miniatures themselves, I think, are just really, really cool. You want to go for a really good thematic color scheme, paint job with them, and, you know, you can make them look really, you know, polished and on parade kind of thing, and they're just done up. You could also make them dark and gloomy, like they've just walked out of a crypt. There are a few different approaches you can take. I think with my collection, I'm going to paint them in sort of like a forest theme, where they've sort of just been like buried underneath a forest, and they're sort of like coming out of their tombs with like clumps of grass on them and stuff like that. Just something I'm looking forward to doing personally. This is a faction that doesn't really have any great big monstrous creatures. It has that, you know, Casket of Souls equivalent guy, but other than that, it's a lot of blocks of infantry that you're seeing here. Another thing about this faction is that they're still a bit new. At the time of recording this video, there are still a bunch of units that would like to see that haven't really been released yet. So there is that. You know, the new sculpts may make or break your decision to collect them in the long run, but at the rate they're going, like the last couple of you know, kits that have come out, like the Varangian Guard, the Bucephaloi, you know, the Caryatids, that sort of thing, they've been looking so cool. Like when you go back and compare what they've currently got now to the first few sculpts that came out, they're just going in such a good direction. And the units themselves, I mean, they just feel very well balanced, despite having a very radical kind of mechanic where they just power up throughout the game, which no other faction does. They still seem to be on par. Like, they still seem to be about your decisions and like how you really play your cards, which I really appreciate. And maybe that's just because I'm a bit new. Like, maybe after a few years I'm just going to be really salty and just whining about power imbalance, and in fact I'm pretty sure I will be. But again, I've just been very much encouraged by the fact that the game developers seem to be addressing like things that really matter as time goes by. Okay, so lastly, we're going to talk about the City-States, which is the newest faction to be added to the game. This is a human faction, but again, they are sort of like the Greek and Trojan, kind of like the Odyssey style, you know, archetype, where their soldiers very much, you know, visually looking like, you know, the movie 300 or something like that. In the old sort of Greek mythology, you've got Odysseus, or Odysseus, as some people call him. And then there's the story of, like, the maze with the Minotaur in it. So they've sort of been inspired by that, and the faction has access to a lot of Minotaur creatures, so that's what makes them feel like the half humans and half, you know, mythical creatures, which is kind of cool. Like, if you want the best of both worlds, if you are discontent with the 100 Kingdoms not having enough mythical creature stuff, but you don't want to go full crazy, like everything is non-human, Wadrun, Old Dominion kind of thing, and you want like the best of both worlds, the City-States is pretty good as far as that's concerned. They are the newest faction, so they've had the fewest miniatures released. One thing that they're going to be getting to soon is more of the clockwork stuff, because you've got a faction where the humans are normal flesh and blood guys, but there's also some like constructs where the troopers are actually just, you know, built together and actually fighting machines. So there's going to be a bit more of that. We do have access to sort of like the giants as well, but they are sort of a bit more Greek themed, a bit more mythical, you know, cyclopean, if you could call it that. So that's fun. I can't wait for them to come out with the war chariots. It's a very unique unit where you can take a regiment of them, or you can have just like a single one. You can't really do that with other regiments in this game. Like, if you play the 100 Kingdoms, you can't take a singular knight. You must take at least 3 of them in your regiment. Whereas with the City-States, you can take a chariot, or 2 chariots, or 3, or 4, or 5, and build it up that way. And these chariots, you know, are quite fast, but they pump out a lot of, you know, shooting as well, because they have these, you know, scorpion-mounted kind of ballista type things, which again, we haven't seen them, but I can't wait to check out the miniatures. And hey, by the time you watch this video, maybe they will have come out with it. But the City-States, again, just coming back to the Minotaurs, you can have a lot of different Minotaurs in this army, but one thing that makes the City-States unique is that they can have these blocks of infantry which are very tactical. They've got a lot of maneuverability, and what you can do is you can take out like a stand which contains 4 models on it. and put a Minotaur in with them. So you've got this Minotaur who's just walking down the road with his smaller bros, and they're all sort of in this unit. It's like an auxiliary kind of thing. It reminds me of the old classic, 3rd edition Warhammer 40k, where if I'm thinking of the right edition, where you'd have a squad of Space Marines that has a Terminator joining it. It sort of feels like that, where you've got the big guy joining the little guys, and I like that. I mean, it makes the game feel a bit more unique. It makes it feel like this faction has a thing that it can do that the other factions can't, right? But yeah, I mean, they've got access to spells, they've got access to cavalry, they've got the giants, they've got the brutish minotaurs, they've got the basic troops. They're actually quite a diverse faction. I mean, the only thing that they're really missing is just like a really sort of brutal faction-wide ability that sort of unifies them a little bit. Like the Wadroon have the chance building up to, a really big play. The city-states don't have something like that. The Old Dominion have this tier system where as they take casualties, they are ramping up. The city-states don't quite have that. The Nords, as you're taking casualties, they just get more ferocious and fearsome and just start bashing you. The city-states don't have something like that. The 100 Kingdoms, all of your army lists, you can choose one character to be your warlord and have that ability affect your whole army. 100 Kingdoms can have 2 of those, but the city-states don't have something like that. But the city-states obviously have a bunch of other little things that are unique to them that people don't really have a copy of. So I might end the video there. I hope you guys have enjoyed this review. This is coming from somebody who hasn't really, got into Conquest that much, but I have been studying it. And I have reached the point where I can see the differences between these factions, and hopefully this gave you a bit more of an idea of the style of each of these Conquest factions, and that might help you make up your mind if you're on the fence between, one particular group or another, and you like the models for both, and, you're thinking about taking the plunge and getting into this game. Alright guys, keep an eye out for more of my stuff. Like and subscribe if you haven't already and all of that, and I'll see you in the next video.